Hello, and welcome to Lesson 5, Buddhism and Confucianism. Now, this lecture is going to be much shorter than the rest because, as it happens, this one falls kind of right in the middle of two prominent points. So we are at the end of Buddhism, in which Huston Smith discusses certain variations, some of the most popular variations, and then an overarching claim. And then we go into Confucianism, more of the historic facts that led to the rise of Confucianism. So this lecture is really only 6 slides long, and starts with Zen Buddhism, or more accurately, finishes up Zen Buddhism from the last lesson, then goes into kind of like the image of the crossing with a little bit about Tibetan Buddhism, and then we jump right into Confucianism, discussing the first teacher, problems that Confucianism or Confucius himself faced during his time, and then it will end with rival answers. That way we can pick up the next lesson right where Confucianism comes in with what he believes the true answers are to the crises he faced. So we last left off with the 3 limitations of words for Zen Buddhism and basically discussed how words can only go so far, especially when compared to experience. Zen Buddhism even goes so far to state that when it comes to the mystical experience, words elude that experience in its entirety. So the rest of this section is really devoted to the practices of Zen Buddhists. And so we're going to focus on their particular arguments for the limitation of reason. So although Zen Buddhists have a very pessimistic view of words, they still have texts. So if you think of Hinduism, which has the Vedas, or Confucianism, that has its classics, and Judaism with its Torah, and Christianity with its Bible, and Islam with its Quran, you could think of the Zen Buddhists having the sutras. Sutras that they actually share with other branches of Buddhism. Yet Huston Smith does elaborate that one glance at these texts will reveal just how unlike other scriptures they are. But before he can go into detail, and by he I mean Huston Smith, before he can go into detail about these texts, he needs to describe the practices associated with Zen Buddhism. That way it shields the reader from arriving at some misconceptions. So for Zen Buddhists, reason is limited. When one of the students asks a Zen master, the theories of life or the deep meaning of life, they reply with riddles. They reply with vague answers. And the reason they do this is because the Zen masters see through the questions. They see that the seeker or the student is trying to fill their lack or their ignorance with words and concepts. So it's almost like they're trying to fill their lives with these words. To quote Huston Smith, using every means they can think of to blast their novices out of solutions that are only verbal. Zen refuses to lock itself into a verbal casing. It is not founded on written words. Now, this is a far cry from the Hinduist conception of the ringing in God, in which they could say God's name over and over again, and that gave them the ability to find God. For Zen Buddhism, minds must be sprung from their verbal bonds. And now to accomplish this, we get into Zen practices. Now, the bulk of Zen training takes place in large meditation halls. They are in the lotus position adopted from India, and day after day, they seek to awaken the Buddha mind. But as Huston Smith states, the most interesting feature of this process is the spiritual training of the koan, which basically means problems, or more accurately, riddles. Take one of the examples Houston Smith gives. What was the appearance of your face before your ancestors were born? And another, where a high-ranking officer in the Tang Dynasty asked a famous Chan master, a long time ago, a man kept a goose in a bottle. It grew larger and larger until it could not get out of the bottle anymore. He did not want to break the bottle, nor did he wish to harm the goose. How do you get it out? The master was silent for a few moments, then shouted, "Oh, officer, yes, it's out." Now, at first glance, these are very paradoxical. They sound absurd, but the Zen practitioner is not permitted to just say, it's impossible, and completely dismiss it. The point here is to meditate on these koans until the answer springs forth like sunshine that pierces through a thick canopy of trees. Of course, I'm borrowing here Neo-Confucian imagery, but you'll see the point that enlightenment here is almost like this eureka syndrome, when you're studying something and trying to figure it out, and all of a sudden you figure it out. It's like a bolt of lightning. That is the purpose of these koans. They are supposed to upset your mind. It's supposed to unbalance it and provoke it to revolt against the canons that imprison it. So the Zen master's responsibility here is kind of threefold. First, when the answer is correct, he validates it, which is the least important of his responsibilities. One of the main responsibilities he has is rejecting inadequate answers in order to beat down the students' false conceptions and rid them of their prejudices. His job is also to keep the students energized and determined during the long years of training. All of this is geared towards that moment of mystical experience, that enlightenment, or satori. Now, it's important to understand the distinction of satori as opposed to Mahayanan and Theravadan Buddhist enlightenment. First of all, this experience is twofold. It draws half of its inspiration from the practical or common sense worldly orientation of the Chinese to balance out the mystical order, worldly half. After this kind of enlightenment, there is this practical application where your condition overall improves. You look at life as distinctly good. You have an objective outlook on one's relation to others. Their welfare is impressed upon you as being as important as one's own. The life of Zen doesn't draw one away from the world. It allows you to exist in the world, but with this attitude of total acceptance. In Japanese culture, you can see these practices as Zen monks live their simple lives close to the earth, producing beautiful works of art that are unrivaled in their perfection, and have this spirit of utter tranquility with a calmness that has become almost synonymous with the word Zen. But as philosophy students, we can kind of look at this theory from an outside perspective and say, how does one not use words but then use words? Because they have to use words in order to communicate at all. In order to pass down training, one eventually has to use words. But to be fair, I think Houston Smith brings up this point early in the book when they say Zen Buddhists may not completely dismiss words in their entirety. They may not be a ball and chain on our mind, but they are definitely a ladder that is too short to reach enlightenment. So what he's saying here is that words themselves are limited, and we should understand this limitation. Still, we can use words as a way to negate their chains or bonds that are on us. So that's where these riddles come from. And that is where the sutras or those texts focus their attention. They use words and riddles to excite experience. Honestly, this is where poetry comes from. When we search out these poetic stories or these moral stories, they tell us something about ourselves. In Islamic mysticism, they purposely use these beautiful poems in order to delve into one's own soul. They read these things, and it's somehow like you're looking within, like this looking glass that focuses inside oneself. For example, one of the often talked about images is the caged bird. And the caged bird represents an animal that has this ability and this freedom that we can't even imagine. It is not limited to the earthly ground. It can fly above the trees and pretty much go wherever it wants. And then yet when it's caged and its wings are clipped, it's like we're taking its very essence of liberty and freedom, and we are binding that animal to the ground. So because we understand the concepts of freedom, the concepts of hindrance, that affects us, that means something to us. And it only means something to us because those aspects and that understanding exists in our minds. Because a story is only powerful if you understand it. And that power comes from something inside of you, this depth of understanding. So what you take and what is meaningful from particular stories or poetry tells you about yourself, tells you about how you are oriented and what you believe. And so we're going to see this a lot throughout this world religions class. There is limitation to our words. Our words only go so far in their ability to explain experience, but they are still necessary for communicating tradition. Not merely, as in you can't use words and words alone, there needs to be a sensory experience attached to them. But giving credit where credit is due, at least the Zen Buddhists take a very unique perspective in showing us these limitations. Now from here, the book goes into another very popular form of Buddhism, that of Tibetan Buddhism, that focuses a lot on Tantra, and of course the most popular Tibetan Buddhist, the 1989 Nobel Prize winner, His Holiness himself, the Dalai Lama, the Bodhisattva. But I feel going over another form of Buddhism might make this section a little cluttered, because our main focus is Buddhism at its roots, and then Mahayanan and Theravadan. So our main focus is Buddhism from the Buddha himself, and then that particular split between those two variations. And with that, we'll move into the last section for Buddhism, the image of the crossing. The image of the crossing. The purpose of this section is to talk about certain singular concepts that need to exist in order for a religion to be considered Buddhist. And this image of the crossing points us right back to the definition of Mahayanan and Hinayanan, the big raft and the little raft. But before we get to that imagery, it's important to note that the Buddhists in their entirety revered their single founder and claimed that all the teachings that they appropriate come from the Buddha. So with that out of the way, we can get to this single metaphor. As Houston Smith states, all of Buddhism can be summed up under this single metaphor. this image of crossing a river, a simple everyday experience at the time, crossing a river on a ferry boat. As you could probably imagine, Buddhism is a voyage, and it's a voyage across life's river with a transport from the shore that you reside, which is a shore of ignorance, to another shore of enlightenment. A shore that is barely visible in the distance from where you stand. And yet, we are prompted to seek out the other side. Now, whether we choose to go by ourselves or we choose to go in a group, that's where you see this deviation between the two variants. But in Buddhism, you can take refuge in the fact that there was somebody who made it to the other side and proved that it was possible. And that's the Buddha himself. And the vehicle, the raft of transport that we've committed our lives to in order to trust its seaworthiness that we can make it there, is the Dharmas, the Eightfold Path. And for those who choose to have a group with them, you can have a crew that is very adept at navigating this ship and who we can trust and have confidence in. And those are the Sangha. Regardless, the more you are committed to the task, the more visible the shore becomes. And interestingly enough, especially with this metaphor, once you reach the other side and you're mingling around and exploring this new territory, the less you need the raft and the river that got you there. They are irrelevant. They're not needed anymore. So that is how the image of the crossing is a perfect metaphor for Buddhist philosophy. Life is suffering. Even the pleasures and mundane experience throughout the day is just gilded suffering. It's just there to distract us from this underlying suffering. Because we are finite. And because we are finite, we are inevitably doomed. But there is a way out of this cycle of suffering. There is a way to negate suffering. And one such way that kind of underlines the Eightfold Path, not in its entirety, but still exists in there, is this idea of fighting ignorance, seeking out wisdom. Because wisdom does have a way of cessating suffering. And let me give you an example. And I'll use myself because this did happen in my life. I was very close to my grandparents, and when my grandmother passed away, there was a lot of heartache. And then I realized something. She passed away at 85, and she passed away surrounded by all of her children, her grandchildren, and her great-great-grandchildren. And I thought to myself, wow, I should be so lucky. We should all be so lucky to have a long life, and that knowledge, that understanding gave me comfort. We see this when people seek out motivational books. We see this when people seek out counselors. When they figure something out, when they gain that wisdom, a part of you, a part of that suffering is alleviated. And Buddhism cries out, it's your ignorance that keeps you in this constant mode of suffering. So seek out enlightenment, seek out knowledge, follow the Eightfold Path until you reach understanding. And through understanding, you can alleviate suffering. This concludes Buddhism, and we will move on to Confucianism. Confucianism, named after Confucius, or Kung Futsu, Kung the Master, also known as Kung Zi. Definitely not the first teacher in terms of the very first teacher in China, but considered the first teacher because he stands first in the ranks. Because, as Houston Smith points out, though Confucius did not author Chinese culture, he definitely was its supreme editor. And on a side note, we did hint at, especially through Zen Buddhism, the practicality of Chinese thought. Arguably, that notion is exemplified more in Confucianism than any other form of Chinese philosophy, for good and for worse. And this is because Confucius went into public office because he believed that his theories would not be taken seriously unless he showed that they worked. So the practicality of his theory, the practical application, actually hindered the teachings of Confucianism, because Confucius himself believed he had to get into public office first to test them. Without testing these theories, he believed no one would take him seriously. Luckily for Chinese history, he was incorrect in this consideration. But this is what I mean when I say in this instance, this practicality could have held him back. Luckily, this practicality was combined with integrity and determination not to fail. But it is important for us, in order to understand Confucianism, that these theories are meant for practical purpose. Its devotion is not so much towards the theoretical, but rather is motivated by the constant need to get out of a turbulent time. So let's start with Confucius, born in 551 BC. As stated earlier, his goal was to enter public office. But unfortunately, most of his life would be dedicated to traveling to different provinces, looking for a ruler that would promote him high enough to test his theories. What ended up happening was that these rulers would go to him for advice, and that advice, coupled with some students that would gather around, would become his legacy. But Confucius was very confident in his ability to reorder society if he was given the chance. When asked what should be done from overpopulation or the quick growth of population in the state of Wei, he answered with his famous reply, "Enrich them, then educate them." And this is the first hint of one of the foundations of Confucianism, also called the classics, when he says educate them. Because Confucius believed that through education, we hone in our instincts. And I'll get more into that later on. But that is what Houston Smith is hinting at in this second page of the chapter, by quoting this famous reply. While unsuccessful, though, as Houston Smith points out, doting biographers, unable to conceive that a man so gifted could remain permanently blocked in his life's ambitions, credit him with 5 years of brilliant administration in his early 50s, years which he is pictured as advancing rapidly from the Minister of Public Works through Minister of Justice to Prime Minister, in which Lu became a model state. This ideal state was romanticized so much that it was stated that something could be dropped in the streets and it wasn't picked up. What this means is that nobody took it for themselves, which points to the righteousness and benevolence of the Lu province. But this is passed off as a romanticized biography, because the truth is, at that time, the rulers were much too afraid of Confucius's candor and integrity to appoint him to any position involving power. And Confucius wasn't one to shy away from the truth. There's an account when a ruler of his own state who usurped the throne came to Confucius and asked him for advice. Confucius replied that he'd better learn to govern himself before governing others, hinting towards the foundational account of social order that begins with governing oneself, understanding one's family, and bridging that ideology to the state, something that we will discuss in far more detail later on in this chapter. Giving examples of his integrity, there are often stories told about rulers giving him honorific posts just to keep him quiet, something that as soon as Confucius found out, he resigned. He spent his years wandering from state to state, offering unsolicited advice to rulers on how to improve their governing, seeking a real opportunity to put his ideas into practice, and then eventually spent his last 5 years quietly teaching and editing the classics, ancient books on Chinese values. Houston Smith describes Confucius as a one-man university, like Socrates, that preferred to converse on problems with students, while not for a moment assuming that he was a sage. Now, in Confucianism, the sage is the highest master. But Confucius was uncompromising, settling for nothing less than readdressing the entire social order. But he wasn't otherworldly. He wasn't a god. He would often reminisce about archery as a child and hunting and fishing. He also loved people, loved to dine out, join in the chorus of a good song, drink, but not in excess, was even sarcastic. But in his drive, in his purpose, he was a man of integrity who stayed faithful to his quest. He could have had power and wealth if he was willing to compromise his integrity with those in authority. Now, Confucianism is known for its anecdotes, moral maxims, all from these teachings. Some of them you might have heard. For example, the Golden Rule. What you do not wish done to yourself, do not do to others. A moral maxim that holds you accountable for understanding ethics and morality. Look no further than your own beliefs. Look no further than how you want to be treated in order to understand how someone else wants to be treated. While this morality is often passed off as utopian, it is interesting to note that ethics isn't difficult. It is ingrained in us. Now, whether we have the ability to put faith or stock into that notion is a whole nother argument entirely. You almost have to believe in the goodness of people in order for this to work. But Confucianism does point to the hope that if you want to find morality, if you want to understand it, it is ingrained, even though you will probably need guidance in order to discover this inherent morality. It's almost like this mirror that life kind of tarnishes, and you need help dusting it off and scrubbing off the debris in order for that intrinsic or inherent benevolence, that inherent morality to shine forth. This theory on the existence of an inherent moral nature will really take hold in the West under the scope of intuitionism. And for those that are interested in this moral ideology, you can research W.D. Ross. Another famous one is, when you see someone of worth, think of how you may emulate. When you see someone unworthy, examine your own character. This right here hints to another fundamental philosophy in Confucianism, this master-student relationship. If you want to be a master, if you want to be a sage, then you must learn from a master or learn from a sage. How did they acquire these teachings? Through the classics. Why did Confucius focus so much on tradition? Well, to understand that, you need to understand what kind of world and what kind of problems Confucius faced. So what kind of world did Confucius face? Well, a world of complete social anarchy. That's not to say that China was worse off than other places in the world, but in the 8th and 3rd century BC, China witnessed a collapse of the Zhou dynasty and its ordering power. And as a tale as old as time, when order is destroyed, chaos resumes. But the fall of the Zhou dynasty led to what's considered the period of the Warring States, or the Warring States period. This is an age of almost continuous warfare. Warfare that, ironically enough, started off chivalrous, with chariots as weapons and courtesies as the code. Even generosity was accorded high honor. However, this continuous warfare would eventually degenerate from chivalry towards horror, reaching its height the century following Confucius's death. The noble would no longer hold their prisoners for ransom. Conquerors would slaughter their opposition. There was even stories of the conquered being thrown into a boiling cauldron, with their relatives being forced to drink the human soup. With this uprising of anarchy, one question kept coming to Confucius's mind: how can we keep from destroying ourselves? Where did this social degeneration come from? And Confucius's answer was that the glue that held us together is instinct. Look at a herd of cows. They don't need to learn to be social. Look at the hive mind. Working together is natural. The issue for the human race is that cohesion eventually disappears. We often fight our instincts. That's what's attributed to our growth. We no longer just behave like animals. We try to hinder our instincts in order to progress. But this hindrance comes at a cost. We start to forego certain customs that held us together. These customs that were built on trial and error over long periods of time, that would sand out our rough edges to promote well-being. These behavior patterns that would take over centuries to shape would eventually be tossed out under this umbrella of progression, a progression towards the civilized. And those that did not gain these patterns were killed off. And of course, the pattern that I'm referring to here is this pattern to think as a social group. A social group that was necessary to keep a community intact. This social custom would eventually be known as tradition. So if tradition that promoted social cohesion is what kept us together, then the answer to what causes social anarchy, and by now with Hinduism and Buddhism in our rearview mirror, you can probably guess what the problem is. We move from group ideology and group consciousness to individualism and selfishness. Instead of an identity that relies on the plural, we think in the singular. We think in the first person. Reason was replacing social convention, and group interest outdistancing the expectation of the group. What's in it for me became the motivation. Working our way out of the cake of custom, out of tradition, towards individualism and self-consciousness, which is very contagious. Once they appear, it spreads like an epidemic. I absolutely love the way Houston Smith puts it. Unreflected solidarity is a thing of the past. And what this means is it's no longer the default. It takes effort now to think as a group because of the hold individualism has on us. But Confucius wasn't the only one who had answers to this social anarchy. And there are two of which we are going to focus on, because these two directly help us understand further the ideas put forth by Confucianism within the scope of these rival answers. The rival answers, realism and mohism. So when tradition is no longer strong enough to hold society together, human life faces its gravest crisis. And Houston Smith uses the United States as an example to elaborate further. The United States is a nation with many diverse ethnic backgrounds, or the melting pot. But in weakening the traditions that the immigrant groups brought with them, it didn't provide them with any compelling replacement. So as an alternate to tradition, the U.S. proposes reason. If we educate citizens and inform them, they can be counted on to behave sensibly. This is the Jeffersonian Enlightenment faith, the foundation of the United States. This concept that if a person knows what they shouldn't do, then they won't do it. And yet, under this Jeffersonian Enlightenment, the United States is the world leader in crime, delinquency, and divorce. This is, of course, used by Houston Smith in order to motivate that reason does not work very well to hold a society together. So one must look towards an alternate path. So what can be done to hold society together? Well, the realist answer is the only way to avoid universal violence in a society composed of self-seeking individuals. That is to say that we already have self-seeking individuals, and it's kind of utopian to believe that they will start thinking as a group again. So the only way to maintain social order with so many selfish people is to effectively create a militia and a law that has the teeth to punish the people who go against the laws that are meant to promote order. Therefore, in order to maintain social harmony, we have to give up certain rights, like the right of the strongest of the fittest. We have to give up that right to the government. We have to enter into a social contract, a binding contract that we will follow these laws as long as you protect us from that animal instinct. Now, how much power you give a government in order to promote social order is arguable. You could take one extreme point like Thomas Hobbes in his book Leviathan that believed you give ultimate power to the government because we can't be trusted. When the people alone are left to govern themselves, it becomes a state of nature. A state of nature is complete anarchy, where it's survival of the fittest, dog eat dog. As Thomas Hobbes states, it is a world that is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and above all short. This would be a time that nobody would want to live in. So we give up our rights in order to get out of the state of nature. And there's kind of like a middle road, this John Locke social contract theory based on his famous book, Two Treatises on Government. You may know him as the philosopher whose ideas we borrowed in order to create our Constitution, practically taking word for word the phrase life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, or property, more aptly. He stated that the government is there as a unbiased third party in order to promote social order and harmony. And if they ever start self-seeking, then we as citizens have the right to throw the government out. So basically, government is merely there as a third-party entity. And of course, I'm paraphrasing here and really oversimplifying these theories, but it's more important for us to understand the realist notion that we need laws in order to promote social order. And these laws need to have teeth to them. But more importantly, for Confucianism, this realist ideology presupposes a very bleak outlook on human nature. By its definition, our base instincts supersede our noble ones. If you notice here, they're not arguing that goodness isn't intrinsic. They're just saying if it's to emerge at all, it needs to be built into. We need to forge it. Houston Smith says it's like the wood in a straightening press, but I prefer the old Confucian verbiage. It's like a sword that needs to be sharpened. At first, it's merely a stone. It needs to be forged into its character, and it is only as good as it is continuously sharpened. In addition to these base impulses, it also assumes, and by it I mean realism, realism assumes that people are short-sighted. Rulers need to have a long-term outlook, that kind of foresight, but their subjects are not capable of this. This reminds me of Niccolo Machiavelli and The Prince. The Prince has this special power that allows him to do whatever he wants because he has the foresight of a ruler. The rest of the subjects, if they were allowed to follow immediate pleasures because they are so short-sighted, they will soon become victims of pain they most dread. Basically, they'll eat themselves to death. But one issue of many with this realist answer is that you're almost waiting for this legendary noble person to come in and save you. So in this warring states period, you're out there in the ocean and you're drowning, and all you are hoping for is this amazing skilled swimmer to materialize and save you. You may also say that another issue, or another prominent issue here, is that they have such a bleak outlook on humans. How are we even to say that being governed will help this out, or having laws will help this out? Because then having the law and being afraid of the law will only work in so much as the people remain scared, that they'll be caught. It doesn't address the issue. But as far as the bleak outlook, you may want to forgive the realists because they are living in a time where the conquered are being boiled and fed to their families. But with that, we move into a much more optimistic solution from the Moists. Now, the Moist, which is named after their founder, Mo Tzu or Mo Tzu, proposed as a solution to China's social problem, not force, in that not force of law, but love, universal love. One should feel towards all people under heaven exactly as one feels of one's own people. And Houston Smith points out automatically a glaring issue here. It is very hard to sell on someone that they should care about the rest of civilization more or even equal to one's own family. It is far too utopian in its solution. Still, these two solutions will echo throughout because fundamentally they talk about two distinct things. In one aspect, we have love, generosity, and understanding at its core. In the other one, we may have that, but it's so hidden that we need to shape and forge ourselves into moral characters in order to promote social harmony. And with that, we will end this lesson. The following lesson, lesson 6, we will really delve into Confucianism in its totality. So have a great day, and I'll see you next time.